Okay. Well, he was born in the Isle of Man in 1940, in 1945. And the fact that he was in the Isle of Man is kind of important because I personally have never been to the Isle of Man, but from what I'm reading about it, it really is, was, I may say at that time, was a very separate country. It's in between Ireland and England. And there was in fact a special language at the time. Remote. It was very remote. And his first book, which he did, was about the Isle of Man. But he in fact, his parents were publicans. His father had a pub, and he was born in a pub. And he had literally the father's whole life. He just changed from pub to pub. Basically, he was a publican. And the interesting thing about Chris KILLIP is that he went to the local school and he was very bad at it. He says later on, he left at the age of 16 with mutual agreement. They wanted to get rid of him and he most certainly wanted to leave. Well, this is very strange considering that the end of his life when he comes to be the head of art and so on at Harvard University. Anyway, let's have the first two and I'll show you what I mean, because there's some lovely photographs. There's the pub, it's rather nice, isn't it? Rather nice pub, this one. And in fact, and there is a photograph of him and his sister, who was a year older than him, outside the pub. And there's the little card, you see, that says Highlander Inn, and it tells you where it is. And this is when this particular little photograph is about when they're about sort of 5 years old. Now, the one underneath the pub is yet another pub that he moved to much later on. The father moved to much later on, because this is the pub in which KILLIP literally did all his work. He spent his evenings working for the pub, and his father paid him when he decided to be a photographer. Now, on the lower right, it's very interesting because all of you will recognize this, because this is Justin de Villeneuve and Twiggy, and this is the 1960s. Now, briefly, this is what happened. He was a mad cyclist, and he used to tear around, as a little boy, he used to tear around on his bicycle. And his friends, they for some reason or other took the magazine Paris Match. And in Paris Match one day, he saw a photograph by Cartier-Bresson, which we'll talk about later. And at that very moment, he decided that that's what he wanted to spend his life doing. Well, his father was a bit disturbed about this because after leaving school, rather unfortunately at the age of 16, the father had put him into a sort of a hotel sort of place where people were sort of taught how to look after hotels and pubs and things like that. And he left that and he went to London. And he said, I'm going to go to London. What happened is when he decided to be a photographer, he took himself off to the local photographers. You know, it was a sort of a seaside place. And so he moved about, he did all sorts of things for that. He got enough money to live in London. So off he went to London, where he lived with another boy from Manx. And the important thing about this is that this boy was at the Royal College. And so through this friend, he was able to see that we used the library, really. Now, he was a bright child, and he realized that the thing to do was to find out the most successful photographers in London. And he wanted to be he had no training, you see. And so he actually, he moved around, and finally he got employed by Justine and the Twiggy photographs. And he became a very successful assistant. So successful, in fact, that they were having an exhibition in America, and they sent him to America to sort out the exhibition. And then he had this most extraordinary experience. He actually saw the work of very, very great photographers. Now let's look at the next one and I'll show you what I mean. Now here we have these really marvelous photographs. The first one, this particular exhibition was in MoMA. And this was August Sanders, a German photographer. And this is a bricklayer. This was 1928. The one in the center was an American photographer. This is Paul Strand. And the thing that they had in common, all of these people, is that they were genre photographers. And this one in the middle was actually an Italian family, and it's the Lisetti family. And it was a book that was about Italy, that which was published in 1953. And the one on the right was contemporary. And this man is called William Eccleston. And he was born actually in 1939. So he was basically the same age. And this one is called, I think is very interesting, the title is interesting, Summer, Mississippi. And it's in the background, it's the Bayou. And you see the interesting way that he's described the South. You see the man in front and the assistant behind. And I think this is what KILLIP picked up, because when he came back to the Isle of Man, he decided quite firmly that he was not going to be a commercial photographer. He said he discovered that photography, rather than being something done for clients, could be done for its own sake. And he said, you just do it. And so he got his father. He said he'd work in the pub in the evening if his father would support him. And he decided that the only thing, literally looking at these people working on things that they knew, what did he know? He knew about the Isle of Man. And so he decided to start photographing the Isle of Man. Okay, and these are the ones we're going to see first. And they are, but this one is very, very important, because it's this particular photograph by Cartier-Bresson, which was 1954, that caused him to become a photographer. And look at that little boy, isn't it wonderful? Those two huge bottles of wine. And of course, it's the street. And this was what really inspired him. And all his life, when he went on to be a teacher, as I later on have told you, he always used this picture again and again. And finally, he won an award, the Cartier-Bresson Award. The picture on the right is the Isle of Man. He's back in the Isle of Man. And he's very careful about titling these people very carefully, because it's Mr. Stanley Quirk from the Crooks and Grebe farm of 1971. Now, the interesting thing is that, as I say, he really understood very, very strongly. He understood the people in the Isle of Man, but much more importantly, they knew him, or at least they knew their father. You see, the father had been a publican, as I said, and he'd been all over his pubs been all over the Isle of Man. And so literally, quite often, the people that it was knew, if they didn't know him, they knew the family. Okay, next one. It made a difference. This is absolutely extraordinary. This one you'll know. I mean, it's a terribly, terribly famous one. It's by Dorothea Lange, and it's about, of course, the 1930s in America. You know, this is Migrant Mother of 1936. And you know, this was the time, the terrible time of the terrible poverty. And these wonderful photographers all did this, and they became internationally famous. And there's no doubt that he knew about this work. He did know. And the one on the right, which I think is very interesting, he's been looking at the way that this photograph is composed. And this one is one of his. And it's Mr. Johnny Moore, not John Moore, but Johnny Moore. And it comes from Ballalona in 1971 in the Isle of Man. And he begins to understand very strongly. Now he's using, at the time, he starts with a 35. Now I'm going to put this on to my friend. He starts with a 35 camera, but he
35 millimeter camera.
But he hires a 5x4
plate. Yeah, like a single lens photographic, a 5x4 is this dimension of the film, and it's a plate lens camera, which we'll explain a bit later on. But basically, you don't have the film on a roll like you do with a 35 millimeter. You have the film on like it's a single sheet, and basically you just open the lens So your aperture opens, you take the shot, and then the lens closes, and then you pull out the film. And then you either sort of develop it, or it's a kind of instantaneous, like a sort of Polaroid type thing.
Now, the interesting thing about it, should have told you before, is that he didn't have a darkroom. So when he took these photographs, he had to go to London to his friend to use his darkroom. So it was a very sort of slow thing, really. He took hours doing these photographs. He spent days and days sometimes photographing with the people who had to be very patient, I think. Next one.
And then what about the way that he works in space?
Oh, yes.
He would move around.
Oh,
Did you mention that?
Yes.
He would move around, but then he realized that standing in space.
Oh, yes. Yes, I
was
should
better.
have said that. I should have told you, by the way, that I urge you to look at this film on the television. And
On
it's
YouTube.
on YouTube, and it's a conversation between Martin
Parr
and KILLIP. And this is, he really describes his discipline, because he discovered that he spent a lot of time wandering about, and if he didn't get the first shot, he sort of went somewhere else and have another go. And he literally forced himself to stay in the same position to eventually the film to find the film. Okay, next one. Now these again are absolutely amazing. Again, this particular one, which is the Berlin coal carrier, and it's August Sanders, the man we saw before, and the one on the right is his Mr. Radcliffe, and this was in Baradella. And this is 1972. And there's a very sweet little story about this. He talks about it later on in this conversation, that the cat, he went back when he got his things, because he tended to give these people copies of the photographs. When he came to give his copy, he found this Mr. Radcliffe in great state of despair, because the cat had died, which I think is rather sweet. Okay, next two. Now, these are some of the most beautiful ones, and they really do describe a way of life. Now, this is very important, because he was beginning to be aware that this way of life was in danger, because there's no doubt about it, the Isle of Man became suddenly popular for tourism. And this one we're seeing on the bottom there is a landscape. It's called the Lion Rocks, and this particular one was 1870. The one in the center again is a family, and it's Mr. Ned Christian, son John, and daughter Brenda, and this is Rushton in the Isle of Man of 1970. And the one I think on the right, which is absolutely charming, it reminds us of what it was like actually to have one room in the house with a coal fire to keep warm. And this is the cottage, and this is 1972. But look at, you see the fire and everything. This is the only place you could really get warm. Okay, next one. Now this one is again very interesting. This is called the Slot, and it's again in Rushton, and it's February 1972. And when we went to see it, Camilla pointed this out, that on the whole, if you look at this diagonal on this, the way that the diagonal is put here, you'll find it in all his pictures. It seems to be a particularly interesting way that he sees the landscape.
So always you have the frame.
Yeah.
If you think about the frame
Yeah.
of the camera, almost like in a cinematographical sense, he uses this diagonal as a kind of dynamic way to destabilize not only the viewer, but the space of what you're looking at
exactly.
as well. So if you think about an interior and exterior.
You see, when you look at it carefully,
well,
you see there's a little tiny house, but the house is hardly, and there's another one over there, but you don't see them.
Exactly. Yeah, well spotted. So
Yeah.
you have this horizon, you have this cutting across.
And the sense of emptiness is important, you see, because this is what's going to change when the tourists come. And this one I think is terribly interesting because, of course, it's something very, very special to the time. Because what are they doing? They're actually, it's called Longham Farm, and they're threshing. But you see, they're doing it all by hand. Do you see? The dogs, the people, and that diagonal again, you'll see again and again. Okay, next one. Now this I think is absolutely lovely. This is Mr. and Mrs. Fletcher, and this is with his son and Ashley, his two sons, Ashley and John. And I think it's marvelous. And the one on the right is even more so. It appears that the Irish fishermen came to bring their fish to the Isle of Man. And this particular, the Irish lads at Port St. Mary, and they're barreling salted herring. And this is 1971. And I think they're marvelous photographs of these young men and those extraordinary clothes. Now, something very interesting happened. In 1971, he still had connections in America with the people that he used to work with. And he went to America again to work for another, to make some money. And he found a dealer who was interested in contemporary photography, but specifically photographs about people. And he himself, and he was so interested in, he had about 12 of these photographs to show. He hadn't finished. He thought there were going to need at least 25 to make the complete set. So this photographer, this dealer, very kindly, not only bought the pictures, but gave him money so that in fact he could go on and finish the series. Okay, next one. It's very important, this. There he is at the top there. There's a photograph of him. Terribly interesting man. He turns out to be the first American, well, the first in the world dealer on just photographs. And he was a terribly interesting man. And he was called Lee Whitkin, and he had a gallery in New York. But sadly, very sadly, he died at the age of 49. And this was a tremendous shock to everybody. The important thing is to look at the way he dealt with his gallery. When you went into his gallery, it wasn't like going to a sort of smart gallery. You sort of sat in the chair and the pictures were given to you. Now, underneath it, again, to emphasize space and time, this particular photograph is very important because it's about a Neolithic burial site in the Isle of Man. Isn't it interesting? The way you see this diagonal?
Yep.
Again. You see it again and again. The one on the right, I think, is absolutely wonderful. The sadness of this man's face. And this is Mr. Gubbin, and this is the Golden Meadow Mill, and he was a miller. And his accoutrements at the back of him. This is a very important one. This is 1970. Now, because of the success, he showed these photographs. He had the money, and he got himself. He applied and got himself a grant by the Arts Council, and they asked him to photograph the Northeast. Now he didn't know about the Northeast. What happened early on? He decided to get on his bicycle. He was mad about cycling. He tried to discover England a bit. And he literally adored the North Country. And he was given this grant, and so he was asked to do these photographs. And this is Huddersfield. And these are quite marvelous. These are the photographs that he's going to be known for. The first one is a playground of 1974. And look at the one underneath, which of course is Jimmy's TV shop. And again, 1974. But the one here is a site of from a farm looking down over Huddersfield. Now, what you're going to see here are the coal fields. in this area, we're looking at the atmosphere, the terrible, terrible atmosphere, the mist and the dark all the time. And the top, which is very interesting, which is called, these are all, by the way, 1974. And this particular one is a house which is just about surviving, because if you see the bottle of milk and the rubbish outside, but everything else is all, there's nobody else living there. And the one on the right, which is quite extraordinary, and this is called the corner shop and the cat. Can you see the little cat in the window? But look at the difference in the light. Look at the outlook of all the coal fields up the side of these. And these particular ones were so successful that he was given another grant. Let's have the next one. This, I think, is terribly interesting, because I suddenly found out, I do admit it was only yesterday or the day before, but I was looking at the television, and there's a program called This England, and this particular time was talking about the terrible problem of the Indian people. Was it Uganda? Wasn't it Uganda? I've forgotten the place it was.
You mean with Mugabe?
Yes, Mugabe. I think it was Uganda.
Yes, I believe it was.
And he actually decided that all the Indians should have to leave Uganda, and they suddenly appeared in not only in England, but they went to Canada, and goodness knows what, an entire race of people. And I think, again, he has addressed it, because these two pictures are very interesting. This one is, these are 1974, and it's a boy with his school report card, and this one is just called Boy, and they're both 1974. And of course here, this is a little Indian boy, because it was 1972 that this terrible problem happened in Africa. And the one on the right, which I think is quite remarkable, he's just called the Whippet Fancier, and that's 1973. Look at the face of the man, and the clothes, and the dogs. Marvelous one of the dogs. Okay, next one. Now, 1973, he comes to London, and he meets perhaps one of the greatest of the international photographers. She was Czechoslovakian, and she had tremendous influence all over over Europe. And she was called, and I have difficulty with it, she was called Markéta Lashkavkova. And she had been born 1944. She was a Czech photographer, and she married another photographer who had English nationality. And so she came, who'd come to England. Of course, it was the time of the communist problems in Czechoslovakia. And she followed him to England and literally didn't go back. And there she met KILLIP. And in 1977, they had a child. And this child is called Matthew. And at the moment, he's in fact now a filmmaker in America. And he comes up a lot in on what we're looking at in this photograph is a photograph of on the occasion of her exhibition. It's the occasion. The occasion of her exhibition actually at the V&A, and on this photograph on the left is a very important photographer friend who's actually Polish, and he's Joseph Kudela. And there she is in the center, and there is KILLIP. And this particular photograph is 10 years later. It's 1983. But why I've put them together is because this is her photograph of KILLIP in the Isle of Man again in 1998. This particular one. Now they lived. He by this time had become completely enamored of the Northeast, and he'd moved to a place not far from Newcastle. He'd got this flat. And so he lived mostly in the northeast. She actually lived around the corner from me. She lived at St. John's Wood. She's still alive. And he says they were together back and forth, really, but it kind of, she didn't like the northeast, and he wasn't keen to stay in London. So the relationship didn't last, but they had this child together. Okay, next one. And this is interesting, I think, because by 1977, the year, in fact, that the child was born, Creative Camera, by now, you see, he was beginning to be well known. His work, for example, the Victoria and Albert Museum had bought many of his films, and Creative Camera, which was the magazine for photography, very unusually devoted the entire magazine article, this particular one, in May of 1970. I think it was 1979, this particular one. 1977. Now the picture in the middle, of course, is KILLIP with his little boy, and outside the gallery in Newcastle. Now he became the co-founder of this particular gallery, because what it was devoted, it was the only one in England at the time, devoted to documentary photography, and it was called the New Gallery. And this, of course, was where he showed his work as well. He became the curator for about 18 months. And this particular photograph here is a much later photograph. This particular one is 1988 of the one, but that's the gallery. And there he is in the center there with his little boy. Okay, next one. Now, what is interesting about this gallery? Suddenly, England was able to see the work of other important photographers. Now, one of the most important, as far as he was concerned, photographer, the one that he looked at most specially, was a man called Weegee, W-E-E-G-E-W. And in fact, his name was, I think, Archer Felding or something. He was born in Ukraine in 1899, and he worked in America. He worked in New York. And what is important is the fact that he was the first time to use this plate. During the day, he used a flash. This had never been done before. So these photographs are done in the daylight, but they're done with flash. And it gives them a sort of theatrical, doesn't it, really? Do you think so, Camilla? A kind of theatrical feeling. You're looking almost like a movie, aren't you, really?
Yeah, so it looks like a spotlight is sort of immediately on the subject.
And these are absolutely marvelous. This one on the left is a Harlem mother and child. And the Harlem mother and child is 1968. And the one in the center, which I think is absolutely wonderful, is the children on the East Side. He was a photographer, he was a newspaper photographer, really, to a large, but it was enormously important. The one in the center is 1946. And the one on the right, which is the drunk, was 1940. Now, these were very important to him. And one of the first things he did when he started to become a curator for this new side gallery, he had an exhibition of Weegee's work. And so suddenly England was able to see the work of other people. Okay, next two. It's important. But most important, it was of course, his first book. Now, his first book actually, although finished in 1972, was in fact, and of course it was the Isle of Man, was not actually finished until 1980. And here we've got the facade of the first one. And the interesting thing about that marvelous man, the dealer, right in the center of him doing it, when he realized that the KILLIP would be out of money, he sent him more money so that he could complete it. And so really it was because of him that the KILLIP's first book was able to be published. And it really is quite marvelous, really. Now, by now, he's completely committed to the Northeast. And he's as I say, he's now living there. And he begins to photograph the end of the industrial North. Okay, let's have the next one. And these are marvelous. These are the end of these is this particular one of the group going to work in Wallsend in 1977. And this is one of the last of the big ships and the Tyne Pride from the back lane in Wallsend of 1975. Now, the important thing about these pictures is to realize how completely involved the living area and the working area was. Good heavens, that looks as if it's in the back garden, doesn't that incredible ship? I mean, you literally couldn't you couldn't move about in this particular place without being aware of the shipbuilding. Okay, let's have the next time because they are marvelous. This particular one is outside Redhead Shipyard in the South Shield Tyneside, 1977 here. And again, and this is the last days of the shipbuilding, the same 1977. Now we're going to see what happens at the end of industrial world. Here, we're still there. We're still just there. The one on the left shows you the connection again. What is important is to understand that he understood how important the actual lives of everybody was with the shipbuilding, because this one again is showing the last ships on the left, and it's looking west from Camp Road, Wallsend, 1975. And the one in the center, the one on the right, is of course the building of these large ships. This is the Everett Wells ship, and it's a shipyard of Wallsend, again, 1975. And you see the sheer amount of people that are working on this. And this literally was their world. Okay, next one. Well, this is the point that we made. And this is so interesting. These two pictures are incredible because on the one on the left, again, shows the connection between the people who live there and the ships. It's the Tyneside last ships of 77, the children, and then on the right, the end. Camp Road in the snow, same road, no ships, all gone. And this is the end of 1977, this is 76. It's quite extraordinary here. And these are, the next one shows you what happens. And what happens, of course. They demolish the houses. And this is the demolition. And this one on the right is one of the most famous and the most tragic ones. This is the Youth on the Wall in Jarrow, in Tyneside, in 1976. Now, he, by now, was involved with this gallery. And he decided that he wanted the local people to be able to afford to buy his pictures. So he did very cheap, you can see him at the top signing them off, and that's the last ships by Chris KILLIP. And he sold them, I think this is terribly interesting. He discovered the price of a pint of beer, and so he sold them for the same price, £3, so that if you went into the side gallery, then you could buy your own ship, these wonderful little books. Okay, next to, enormously important now. We're going to look at an earlier example. And here we have, of course, the most interesting man. This is Bill Brandt. And this is Bill Brandt, of course, working in the 1930s. And it's the coal miners coming up. And this particular one is the one on the left is in Wales, but the one on the right, it's the sea searcher going home in Jarrow in 1937. And there's no doubt that this particular picture was tremendously influential. Now, what we're going to look at now is this very, very strange thing, which is called sea coaling. Now, I'm going to read it to you. A sea coaler is someone who makes their living by collecting and selling coal washed up on the beaches. Examples of beaches in the northeast where sea coaling was practiced, including Seaton Carew and Hordern and Blackhall, and of course Linemouth. and it's the line mast that he does. And there's evidence of the trade going back to the 7th century. There's still a few sea coalers today in Hartlepool, long after the coal miners had shut. But it involves tremendously hard physical labor. Now, it was something that they had to do secretly, because they, by now, most of the coal mines have been shut, and they were all on sort of benefit. And if it was discovered that they were actually getting coal and selling it, their benefit would stop. And so it was very, very secret. And it took him 8 years to persuade them. One person, one young man, they met in a pub, and he realized that KILLIP was not doing it particularly to make money, but just to show what was happening. Now, the only way in the end he found that he could work, he had a caravan, and the one we're looking at on the left is his caravan. And this particular caravan was on the time mast. We're going to now look at these extraordinary images, and they are really quite remarkable. This particular one, this shows you actually them working on this sea coal situation, and it's just called shoveling coal, and it's 1983. And the one on the right is Gordon in the sea, and this is 1983. And I gather you see that the coal had to be literally by hand, because it came up onto the beach when the tides were in, and they literally sorted out the difference between the pebbles and the coal. And this is what you see this group doing, and it's quite remarkable. The community were very suspicious of him, and it quite literally was because he made a friend of one of the young men called Lesser, okay, next to, later on. This is incredible. This is Brian shoveling coal, and this is 1973. And the one on the right, which is so funny, the thing that is so marvelous about these photographs is the sense of community, because this little girl is having such a good time, and she is actually found this discarded sofa. She's doing this thing, and I think this is great fun. And actually, it's the same family. It's Helen Laidler with her parents, Rosie Bryan, and her sister, Alison. And this is 1983. And you saw Brian on the other one. Now you're going to see Rosie again. And look at the exhaustion. You see here is a bag of coal that they've managed to bring home. This is the son called Rocker, and Rosie going home in 1983. And look at the exhaustion on that face, of the woman's face. And this is so charming, the one on the right. This is Rocker and his toad, 1983. You see, you get this wonderful sense of the community of these people. Okay, next. The humanism of these are quite remarkable. This is called, he's called Boo on a horse, 1984, one of the horses, of course, that dragged them in. But the one on the right, I think, is so sweet. This is Boo and his rabbit. And you see behind him, look at the amount of coal that he's managed to pull back. All in these boxes. And you see these were sold for anything they could get. Okay, next to. This, I think, this girl is so interesting. Everybody, children, everybody had to take part in this. And this is Nini having her lunch, again in 1983. And this is Cookie in the snow in 1984. An extraordinary, beautiful composition. Again, you see the diagonal going through here, which you see it again and again and again, but there's something so mysterious about this. And there's Go and the dogs, of course, trying to get bits of food, which I think the way they treat the children are treated is so marvelous. Okay, next to, look at this little girl. Hand picking coal, 1984. Do you see? Here's a rubber and here's the bits of coal that she's putting in the thing. And this extraordinary one, the same Helen, the same lady of children. Helen with her hula hoop of 1984. And look at the deserted beach behind it. Look at the rubbish and this child mentally enjoying herself playing with the hula hoop. You get this astonishing feeling. Now, not very far from here, there was a beach in which, again, they had been doing this coal thing, but they were making a living, a rather poor living, fishing. Okay, next one was called Skinning Grove. And here you see is a photograph of Skinning Grove at this time. Now, Skinning Grove now, which is just outside Newcastle, has now become very smart, and it's very full of, it doesn't look like this at all. But this is Skinning Grove, late summer of 82. Now here on this one are the young people he's going to be involved with. And this is Beaver, an unidentified youth, and Brian McCabe, and Toothy cleaning nets of 1983. And again, I ask you to look at the composition because it's terribly interesting. Now look at these kids. They're making what money they can from fishing. Okay, next to. This is so interesting because it literally shows them all of these children together on the left. And this is, they're coming from school. Look at their houses in the background. The boy with the very blonde hair is called Lesso. And then there's next to him is Blackie, and there's Beaver here, and Toothy, and Richard, and Whippet, and that's 1982. Now notice about the children's hair, because what we are seeing is the beginning of I can't remember the name of them, gracious me, the thing they're playing.
Punk?
Punks,
No,
yes, the punks. Punks, yes. On the right, here they're waiting for the tide, and this is 1983. What is so interesting is you see the sheer sense of boredom, nothing to do except waiting for the tide. Now, this is going to be very, very sad because at least 3 of these people are going to be drowned. Okay, next to. Here is Lesso, his great friend, and he is the one who helped help the others, allow them to be photographed. And this is Lesso, this beautiful one here is Lesso at sea, and this is 1983. And he's going to drown. This is again Lesso holding forth in the center. And this particular boat is going to drown, and the only one this is going to be saved. We'll see later on. Okay, next one. They're marvelous photographs. This is Anthony, and there's Lesso again thinking here. And this is 82. And this is Whippet sitting. Now the one on the top is terribly sad. This is Simon Coulter being taken to sea for the first time since his father David drowned in 1983. Now what is so touching is that he's got his best clothes on to go and see where his father drowned. The one underneath is amazing. It shows you the desolation of this world. It's crabs, and people, and dogs, and it's 1981. And look at it, the sheer mess of it all. Okay, next one. This is very funny because I'm afraid that Beaver was really right. He was a big bloke, and he was one that survived the the boat that actually the others were drowned because he was a good swimmer. And when he came back, he had a fight with somebody in a pub, and they put him in prison for one night. And he's out of prison. His friend has picked him up, and he's standing in the sun, and he's taking in the early morning sun. And it's 1982, and round his neck you can see the tattoo of his name there. And in the background, it's a sort of a shed which the lobsters were done. On the right, you've got Whippet with the new LP. Now the LP is very important because it's punk and disorderly, and this is 1983. And because of his association with these boys, he was allowed to go into their club in which the punks were, okay, next to. Now there's a marvelous, marvelous story about these. This particular place was called The Station, and it was a nightclub in Swinburne Street in Gateshead during the summer of 1985. Now, he took these photographs in 1985, and years later, when his son was with him, he used to keep all his films in boxes, and his son was going through the boxes, and he picked them up, this particular one, and he said, "Dad, look at these again, look at these again." And he looked at them again, and he published them. And this is why we've got them, and they are quite extraordinary. As they all said on Tuesday, what's so interesting is the anger of these young people. You get to see the ghastly act, the sheer odds. It's at The Station. These are all, and they were discovered by his son when he was in I think it was 2005, I think. Okay, next to. Let's look at them. You see, look at them. Look, you see, liberation and the conflict here. Look at this extraordinary. These are all at The Station. There's many more. I'm only just showing you a few. But it's his sympathy you get all the time. His fact that he's always sympathetic to the people. Look at these young men. Extraordinary. When he actually did publish them, he took them back. They had an exhibition of them in this side gallery, and he took them back and he gave them to the people that were still alive. Okay, next one. Aren't they marvelous? Look at the hair. Isn't it extraordinary? Aren't they amazing? They're really quite remarkable. And as I say, they were eventually put out. This is 85. This is still 85. I mean, they're unemployed, but they're at least enjoy having a sort of successful thing. He's sympathetic to them. Now, what is very happening? He's so upset about this that he's got his friend is the curator of the V&A. It's Mark Hayworth Booth, I think his name is, and he gets in touch with him, and together they persuade the Serpentine Gallery to have an exhibition of this work. And very, very interestingly, the title of the exhibition was called Another Country. Okay, next to. And one of the things that happens is his friend, also a photographer, a man called Graham Smith. These are the work of Graham Smith. Now, Graham Smith is very interesting because he actually was at the Royal College. He started as a painter, and he became a photographer. And he like KILLIP, lived in the Northeast, and both of them showed their work at this side gallery. But very fascinatingly, they got terrible reviews for their work. People were very cross about them. They thought they were being unkind, and he stopped photographing. And now I believe he's a carpenter. He makes his living being a carpenter. but this was a joint exhibition in 1985 in this in other country. Now the one on the left, I think, is called, the titles are interesting. They made this. And you see there's a girl holding Elvis Presley. These are Smith. And the top there, of course, again, it's the same area. It's the Essington Colliery, County Durham, in 1976 at the top. At the bottom, it's the title is very funny. I thought I saw Liz Taylor and Bob Mitchum in the back room of the pub in 1976. And this is Smith. I think they're very splendid. Okay, next one. But here we get much, much more attitude towards this. Incidentally, Smith was born in 1947. They were much the same age. The one on the left is KILLIP, of course, and it's the Glue Sniffers. And this is New Whitehaven, the Cumbria of 1980. They're so bored, they're not interested that he's photographing them, and they're sniffing glue. But I think what is so interesting, when you think of Warhol at the same time, and this is the supermarket, North Sea Tyneside, baked beans, 1981. Okay, next one. This is possibly one of the most famous ones. Astonishing, this poor thin man with his child. So his father and son looking at a parade in Newcastle, Tyneside of 1980. Look at the false teeth and the sadness of the face. And this is his most important book, which was called Flagrant, was published in 1988. The picture on the right is by Smith, and it's an unknown man at a pub of 1976. And as you see, he's playing an instrument. It's a very, 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 very interesting. We were listening to the Bauhaus this morning, and I was thinking how modernist this particular picture is. Okay, next one. By now, he's going to publish in the 1980s a second version of his Isle of Man pictures. What he didn't do in the first one was to include these photographs, which of course were describing what was happening to the Isle of Man. It became the place where they had the TT races. And what we're looking at here are the TT races in 1972. And this, of course, eventually is going to destroy the way of life, because what's going to happen is that it's going to become a tourist place. And I didn't realize this. I don't understand about these things, but it's something to do with money. You can do mysterious things with the money. Did you know that? It's one of those places.
You mean it would be like a betting? Is it?
No, it's not betting. It's people. You know what they do with their money. They put it aside. They don't have to pay tax on it. I don't
Like
know.
a tax haven?
It's a tax haven, yes.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, okay.
Okay, this by now has happened to the Isle of Man. Okay, next one. This is what's happened to our world. Now, what I'm not showing you is his extraordinary set of photographs for the miners' strike. Now, the miners' strike was in 1983 to 1984. And there is simply no question about it, that it absolutely destroyed the North. I mean, the North was, the one on the left is the Durham Miners' Gala of 1984. And the other one on the right is Brother and Sister Waiting of 1981. Now, the important thing is, I'm quoting here a review. This is the Flagrant book, was first published in 1988, and he republished it again in 2008, I think. And it says here, though Chris KILLIP has since rejected the idea that its subject matter is the human fallout of Thatcherite policies in the industrial northeast of England. It's hard to look at these images now without considering the social and political context in which they were made. Okay, next one. Now this Martin Parr. Martin Parr was a younger man, a much, much younger person. And he started out as, of course, using color. And he became a very, very fashionable photographer, a very successful one. He was born in 1952, and he's a member of Magnum, and he became very successful. Now, his view of the Northeast is much, much, much more about the consumer society. And the one on the left is called The Last Resort, and it was published in 1986, and it's New Brighton, which is close to Newcastle. Look at the mess. Look at the excessive, the sense of excess there. And this one, he's been looking at Eccleston, and the one on the right, of course, is again the sort of crumbling town of New Brighton and the children there on it. Now, Chris KILLIP suddenly he'd got all sorts of prizes, and he was very famous, is getting very famous. And he normally would not work for anybody at all, but he got a commission, a very, very important commission by the Pirelli company. And he literally, again, worked on this for years and years and years. And this was the factory, which at that time was on Burton-on-Trent. Of course, like everything else, they closed the factory and they moved it to China. Okay, next two. But these are of those beautiful ones.
That we were talking about the differences between the two of them.
Oh yes, you do that, darling.
And there was Pat and I were discussing how these perhaps it's the use of color versus black and white, but then also how he photographs the subjects, the people inside the frame, that seems much more exploitative. It's not it's not as human and kind and intimate as KILLIP's photography. So it's an interesting kind of comparison that Pat puts both of them together because
of that, really.
I don't think it's not just the color, but it's also, like, for example, the fact that, like, you see the detritus, you see the trash of what they've been eating, or this, for example, this overflowing garbage can takes center stage, or the baby without, parents hanging around or whatever. It's they're somehow less dignified than KILLIP's. KILLIP's are much more human.
Interestingly enough, this Martin, I'm telling you this is just in case you go there, this Martin Parr has opened this very important place in Bristol, which is a sort of combination of a showroom, a shop, but most importantly, it's a place for vintage photographers, and this is where one would find all the English, particularly the English and the Irish photographers of this period, which should be kept. Okay, it's interesting in that point of view. Now, here are the Pirelli ones, and they are marvelous. Now, this is interesting again. Again, you find him being an innovator in every case. First of all, by now he'd made a decision always to only use natural light. When he went into this thing, he discovered, of course, it was absolutely black as you can be, because, of course, tires and so on. And he couldn't see. When he did the photographs, they literally couldn't be seen. He was very upset about this. And so he suddenly remembered his time when he'd been a fashion photographer, and he remembered the way they were using flashlight. And he got a friend of his to stand aside with lights. And so what we're looking at is the factory, but it's they've got lots of lights, around it, and you can see this. So
these are almost staged.
They're almost staged. Yes, they are, but they're very, very beautiful.
again, dignified and
Of course,
respectful.
there is no question that what you're looking
Not
at.
to be romantic about it, but they are.
They
I
are.
mean,
What the point that he was making is the way that the workers are, they're well paid, they enjoy their work, and you get the sense of discomfort, really. Okay, next one. Look, you see the man right behind all this stuff, and this one here, which is so funny, this little one here. Now, this particular one, strangely enough, when it was first shown, and I think it was shown at the V&A, very, very indifferent. By now, nobody wanted to see this, and it didn't get very good reviews, and so nobody wanted to see it. It was by the time that this was published in it was 1990, nobody was interested in an author of any kind to do with work. In the South, I mean. Okay, next two. This is wonderful. Look at this wonderful photograph of this man. Extraordinary circles of the shapes. This is a marvelous piece of work, this one. Okay, next one. Now, very, very interestingly, and if you look at this thing on the television, you must try to do it. You see him talking about it, because this is exactly what happened. In 1991, he finished the Pirelli thing. It had, as I say, no interest in it at all. It was eventually published. In 1991, he was in his dark room and he had a phone call. And this strange creature, who he didn't know at all, suddenly rings up and gets this person, and he says, "I'm from Harvard University, and I want you to come and give a discussion to my students." And he thought he was being sent up. So he said, "Ring me tomorrow." And he rang his friend at the V&A, and he rang another woman and said, "What's all this about?" And the V&A man said, "Oh yes, they've been driving me mad for your address and your phone number. They want you to go and give a lecture to Harvard." And so this is also confirmed by his female friend. So he says, "Okay." Next morning, he's asked the man to ring him the next day, and the man rings him the next day, and it's Wednesday. And he says, "It's very important that you come immediately, because there's a big exhibition. I want you to talk about your work. And would you come?" And he was so surprised and interested in this, and besides which he wasn't particularly happy, because he wasn't doing very tremendously well at the time. And he says, "Okay," and he literally goes. And he says when he gets there, he does his talk, and he talks about his work, and then the same man says to him, "Will you come up and have lunch at the faculty?" And he says, "Of course." And he goes up to have his lunch, and he said suddenly he was in this room with all these men sitting round a table, and he realized that he was being interviewed. And they said, "Would you please come and work for us for a year?" So he says, "Okay." So he works for a year, and he stays there for 30 years. He becomes the head of the art of Harvard, and he becomes a head, and the next year he's given eventually he becomes the head of the department, and he retires from it in 2017. In 2000, he meets from Harvard a woman who was involved in the I think she was a teacher there, but they marry, and he lives very happily with her in Harvard, or near Harvard. And when asked later on again in this film, you hear him say, he's asked why he stopped photographing, and he says, "Well, I was in a foreign country. I did not know anything about these people. I didn't in Newcastle, I knew when I took a photograph who was behind me, who was in front of me, I could understand. But I was in a completely foreign country. Now, very interestingly, at exactly the same time, this Graham Smith gave up photographing. And I think that this has got everything to do with the fact that he was in such despair at the way that we had destroyed all those people in the North Country. I think this was personally think that this was why he did it. In the summertime, he said the only time he did any photography again was he went to Ireland, and because he was asked to go to Ireland to do some pilgrim work, and this is what we're seeing here. I don't think they're particularly interesting. I don't think they work as well. You don't either, do you, Camilla? You don't really think that these work as well as the black and white ones, really.
I mean,
They're,
I don't know. There's obviously a difference, right?
Oh,
because,
yeah.
like, for example, here, I guess if we just speak about it compositionally, he has the lands. There's no more diagonal.
No.
There's no more of that, like, that dynamism.
No,
Everything
exactly.
is laid out in like these rows, right? And I think also the other thing to point out maybe
Mhm.
is the setup of these photos is something that we've already seen before. So we have to recognize
Yeah.
that we're already very conditioned, that we're kind of prescribed to see this kind of arrangement of people in space. Whereas his previous ones,
Exactly.
they are fresh, or they're new.
Completely. I mean, in the end, he publishes this book eventually in 2005.
The Thames and Hudson
and it's
one.
called Here Comes Everybody, this particular sort of group here. Okay,
Yeah.
next one, there's two more. You see them. This is the Fog in Ireland, and this particular one is 40-foot bathing place in the Irish Sea in Sandy Coast, Dublin. But really, he didn't. I'm not sure about his, I just don't know. It doesn't seem to me to be so interesting.
But I think also, I mean, we have to admit, we've seen
Yeah.
a lot of photography like this
Yeah.
already.
Yeah.
So maybe, I mean, he is trying to evolve while
Yeah.
also find his way coming back into photography.
But he didn't pursue it, and he died in 2020. Okay, next to. But before this, they asked him in the Isle of Man if he would mind using his photographs as postage stamps. And I think this is very splendid. And this was 2009, they were made into postage stamps. Now, actually, as I say, he was chair of Harvard Visual Art Department, and he stayed there until he retired in 2017. And it was only then that he began to republish. He republished the Manx ones, and he republished the Fangrassy one. Okay, next one. And here he is, the last photograph. Now I'm asking Camilla to tell you about these, because these are his cameras.
So I think that these are in chronological order. Pat's placed them in chronological order, but she's managed to find some really good examples of the cameras that he used. So this is obviously a kind of large format. I think it would be like a would you say, was it a 5x5 or a 4x5?
It's 4x5.
4x5.
I think.
So it's obviously, you've got your camera lens, you've got your plate in the back, like at the level of where his face is at. He's on a tripod. So this, I mean, all of this kind of references the way that he worked, you know, standing still in space.
As a matter of interest, he died of lung cancer, and look what he's doing.
Exactly. You've got the ubiquitous cigarette in the mouth, which I guess at the time was very popular. So yeah, so everything is kind of braced for that like perfect shot, right? And then here he would obviously be projecting whatever is being captured by the lens is projected onto like a plate or the film itself, which then later he develops into a negative, and in the dark room he would obviously make it larger, or yeah, like what is it called, enlarge it in the dark room. So here you have, so this is the kind of, these two are like handheld versions, but this one here is a handheld version of
with the
this
flash, of course.
with the flash, right? And so you've got your large bulb. And again, the rig that he has obviously is a way to like steady said camera, because he would be, you see how dark the environment is that he's photographing in. So with the aid of the flash and with the rig, he's obviously got stability to have those like really detailed, perfect black and white, sharp images.
And they took, I believe, he says he worked on these are not sudden photographs. They take ages for him.
Well, you pointed out, Pat, that he takes a hell of a lot of photographs.
Oh yeah.
So that again, we have to remember, that's one of the things I personally love about photography, is that you can like take photographs. And then there's also the editing of the photographer themselves. I just watched a documentary, a very good documentary, but with Nan Golding.
She's mentioned
much later photographer than KILLIP, but Nan Golding, she photographed life in New York during the 70s and the 80s. And what she would do would be, she went into like these queer clubs where the gays and drag queens would collect. And what she would do would be, after a night of photographing, she would show them the Polaroids and have everybody pick out what they liked. And so there's this editing process with photography that is really quite special. And here is,
he does the same thing.
Exactly. And then here is just a simple 35mm point and shoot camera that he's using. I think it's a Planell camera. But basically it's a kind of modification where you've got your accordion shaft, and then your kind of like wide aperture like lens, and then it's on a 35mm roll. So here he doesn't need to be taking the film out. You just basically shoot a set of like 36 or whatever, and then you go back and develop it.
I'm going to quote something again. I'm going to quote actually a review of his an obituary in the Observer, and he said, "KILLIP photographed stern-faced adults and bored teenagers with nothing to do and nowhere to go, as well as the landscapes of an older way of life suddenly gone. Terrace houses dwarfed by cranes and chimneys, huge ships looming over the streets. It is the people, though, who draw you in one image of a pair of sea coal gatherers perched on a cart entitled Rocker and Rosie Going Home. You can almost feel the coal coming off the sea, and with it the desperation of such a hand-to-mouth existence. If there is a trace of bleak documentary romanticism here, it is tempered by KILLIP's skill at being simultaneously detached and empathetic. He befriended many of the people he moved among with his camera, and you can sense that he must have become a master of waiting as well as watching. A young man leaning on his friend's car, both of them gazing at something off camera, drips of boredom, the slow ticking of time spent killing time." And he literally is photographing. And I think this is so important now, because we've got to start retraining people, because there's no doubt about it. The North was absolutely destroyed. Okay.
Amazing.